Thanks again for coming back. This is the last session. We've been going 5 weeks, and again, as you've heard, my father can go an hour on every slide, so there's a lot of information behind each one of these. It's an opportunity to condense it down. So no, there is a great deal more information that's available through Wendy and the library, and there's also many books we'll talk about at the end if you want to have more information about Northville. With that, I thought we would first start review. What did we talk about? This is a really quick one. We talked about early Northville, the naming of Northville, the North Village, the topography in the area, all the gravel and what have you. This is where the ice caps, or when the ice age came, it stopped here for a little bit and the gravel came down, and that's why Norfolk Moraine School, that's the moraine or the edge on one side. So in the ice age, it stopped here ever so slightly. That's why the hills, we mentioned 1,000 feet here, down to 500 feet in Detroit. On a clear day on top of some of these hills, you can see Detroit, no question about it. The third session, so we've gone through 2 weeks already. The third session, we talked about the Centennial Parade in 1927. We had a movie of that. My dad was a kid on the sidewalk. His parents were in a float on a Model TT, a Model T truck, you know, and she was with the Norfolk Electric shop with a brand new washer, showing you can buy this brand new washer at Norfolk Electric. And then he went through the slideshow of all the different things in town. We talked about the different neighborhoods, the historic district, Cabbage Town, Beale Town, Orchard Heights, transportation, the founding families. Tonight we're going to talk about churches, schools, and the Opera Mill. We've already talked a little bit about the Opera House because my dad went on that story, so we won't have to talk as much about the Opera House and different dairies, Farm Crest, and what have you in town. With that, let's see if it catches up to us. And questions that came up, we try to ask questions or answer the questions that came up from the week before. And one question that came up that my father alluded to early on was about Northville Downs and the history of Northville Downs. And whoever asked the question, and Wendy asked me to reiterate it tonight, I'll have my father talk about Northville Downs again. History of Northville Downs. What happened at Northville Downs? A question about that. Just what happened. Remember, it was an old sports park. So about the history of Northville Downs, that area.
What did it do with it?
No, I mean the way it was in the past. Early on, yes, early on.
Okay. When we first started the Northville Downs, it was a golf course, a little 9-hole golf course. And then they converted it into a race, a Green County Fair, what you want to talk about.
Yep. The whole area, exactly what you're saying. Yep. It was an open area. It had a little golf course in the middle. A lot of businessmen in Norfolk thought they needed a sports park. Maybe they should race some horses. We talked earlier, they used to race horses up and down Dunlap. You know, not harness racing, but on the horses. From Center Street down to Rogers Street. And the men, or whoever, would have some little bets. But remember, all the streets were gravel in the day. So they would roll the street, and they would have horse races on a Saturday night. Then they had the park, and eventually so they could watch the horses go around.
That was also the Northville High School athletic field. They had the football field down there. They had the baseball field down there. They had the track. When they run the track, they go once around the track for a half a mile, twice around the track for 2 miles. So it's been used for a lot of things. And even when the Wayne County Fair wasn't on the 4th of July, they have baseball games on down there. And they had something going on practically all summer long. They had a baseball game going on down there all summer long. But it's been used for many purposes. And we'll talk about it a little bit more about what I think it's going to be in the future.
We can do that in a little bit. Sounds great. Hopefully that answered the question of the person who was asking about the sports park. And again, all the high school sports were down there. The football field was in the middle of where they run the the horses around. There's a baseball field over there to the side. The track team, instead of going a quarter mile, they went a half mile around there. So it was the place to go see sports in Norfolk at one time. So and then when by the time my father was playing football, basketball, and baseball, the football field was down at the beginning of Hines Park. So Cass Benton Park, where you go into the left, there's some fields. That's where he played his games. They moved it from the middle of that area because there's a little bit more of an area you could watch. It wasn't the big grandstands there in yesteryear like there is today. So hopefully that answered somebody's question. Yes, sir.
High school also had the tennis courts down there, and they also had the baseball field down
right.
there. The baseball field was just as good as the Tigers field right now.
It was quite a sports complex, and it started in the 1870s, 1880s as a sports complex, so with a little golf course in the middle there. So hopefully that answered somebody's question who had that. Another question was about where did everybody put the trash in Northville at the time? And my dad, I'll let him talk about the main area, the trash area, but hang on for a second. There's a couple other ones around too. One by Rural Hill where you go into the right. When I was a kid, you could always dig up bottles. Within about 5 minutes, you'd find 5 or 10 bottles as you dug down into the sand. That was one area. But the main area in town was where the DPW is today, right there by the Chamber of Commerce. If you want to talk about the trash in town, and you even worked down there by the DPW, where it was.
Trash?
The DPW.
The junk?
Yeah, where the junk was. Yes, the junk. The trash.
At one time, on 7 Mile Road, from 7 Mile Road, all the way down, all the way back, so where the fountain is, where you can do fresh drink of silver spring water, there's quite a valley in there right along the side of the railroad track. So for about 50 years, they started, everybody had all their junk, all their tin cans, all the ashes from the furnaces and the stoves, and they take them down there and dump them just underneath the railroad track, all the way to 7 Mile Road. They started filling that in, so it took them 50 years to fill it in from 7 Mile Road back to the VFW, where the VFW all is right now. When I was in high school, I said to my father, "Can I borrow their truck?" He said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I got some ladies and they want me to go to their house and take the ashes out of the basement and take them down there to the dump." And so I loaded that little truck up. Gee, the truck went right down. It was a flat tires. I took them down there and I shoveled it off there. And I really earned my money. But that was the big dump down there. Once that got filled, then the next dump in Northville was on the corner of Linden and Linden Court. You know where Linden Street is, over here.
By Randolph Street and Linden.
Anyhow, there's a big valley in there. So the city of Northville said, "Hey," the city of Northville, the village of Northville, says, "We have no place to dump the junk. So this man wants us a 20-foot hole filled in." So everybody took all their junk down there on Linden Street and dumped it in there. So it took about 2 years to fill that all in. So you know what happened after that? They put some dirt on there. They sold the lot, and the man built a house on it. So what do you think happened to the house? Yeah. So they had to move the house off it, and the whole thing sunk right down. So they finally put more dirt on there. And there's an indoor house on there now, but stupidly they built a house right on top of the junk. it didn't work out.
So hopefully that answers a couple of the questions that came up after the session last week. Again, early on we talked about my father grew up at 222 Fairbrook, right on the left side. That house is still there today. Where the pond was across the street, where that 7 Mile, that didn't used to be there. This is where my mother grew up, where the original OLB services were, on High Street and Dunlap Street. That house is exactly like that today. We talked about the pond. That was out, as my father went out the front of his house at 222 Fairbrook, walk across the street, and that was the edge of the pond. And we said, in this time of year, you can see if you come up from the racetrack, from Norfolk Downs, heading towards South Lyon, going west, you can see the dirt dikes on either side where that used to be a pond. You can't see it when all the leaves are out, but when you go down there, look at it, you can see both sides of the pond, and we'll talk a little bit about Henry Ford and his what he did to help that. We talked about Wall Lake, and it was a huge amusement park area, and my parents used to go watch Tommy Dorsey and all the big bands, and they had speedboat races, and they had a dance floor. That was big in the 30s and the 40s. Even in my time, the roller coaster was still there, but it wasn't used anymore. That's in the 60s. So it was quite the entertainment place in the time. We talked about different homes. These are a couple of them. The old Chase home on Griswold and 8 Mile, and East Lawn Sanitarium on top of Buckner Hill. That was a mansion in the front of it, and the Buckners lived there, and eventually it was a tuberculosis center. That was a private one. If you had money, you would go there. If you went as part of the state, you would go out to Mayberry State Sanitarium, which is Mayberry State Park. We talked about all these villages around here. How did they start? They had a mill. You know, Norfolk had a mill where the mill race is. That was a grist mill, then eventually a sawmill, then Henry Ford bought that. We'll talk about. There was a mill at Meads Mill. Meads Mill were the Meads brothers, and right where Meads Mill School is, that was a town as big as Northville. And what didn't it have that we said? It didn't have a church, so it didn't have a chance to survive there. And out at Phoenix Lake and Wilcox Lake, all had different mills there. So now we're on, when my dad did the video, this is his mother, and his father's driving the Model TT truck in the 1927 parade. My father is around on the sidelines, and he always thinks he sees himself, but there's kids running around. We saw that movie. This was about Mr. Stenson drove the planes through town during the parade. They built planes, and we have a couple books about the Stinson aircraft, and he was a friend of my father's too. He lived at the end of our street, Eaton Drive and Thayer Boulevard. But Stinson was actually behind that, the wheel in the parade waving to everybody. They used to build the plane without the wings here in town across from where the well is, the Chamber of Commerce now they call it, and they would drag them out to 6 Mile and back, put the wings on, and go testify out there. Okay? This is, we talked about the ski jump hill at the beginning of Hines Park and 7 Mile, the Northville Fair, Wayne County Fair, largest fair in the state other than the state fair, and that's right where that continues the concept, Norfolk Downs. What was happening there? Huge fair every year. I mean, for 10 days going on. My dad talked about that. The Fish Hatchery Park, one of the buildings there to the left, and Mayberry Sanitarium, that's on the corner of 7 Mile and back. And that was still there even in the early 70s. That was the main entrance back then, all the way, come down 7 Mile, right there on that corner going into Mayberry. We talked about Rogers, the Rogers family. Mr. Rogers came up with the idea of condensed milk. He had a little factory right on the base of where Eaton Drive is and 7 Mile. Got pretty big because everybody wanted condensed milk once he came up with it. That factory that you see up there in the upper left corner was down by the Cider Mill, right on the railroad tracks, so he could put his production right on the rail cars. The Cider Mill is right across the street. We talked about individual Mr. Parmenter, came back from the Civil War and had enough money to start that right where it is. It's still not, he's not in his family today, but it's still personally run. We talked about the old Opera House, could seat 800 people. That was on the corner of Dunlap and Center Street. It was gone by the time I was around. They demolished it in the 50s, and Henry Ford, we'll talk about that a little bit about the Opera House. And the trolley cars, how my dad used to go to Pontiac, and there was 2 trolley cars coming in and out of Northville. And you could get down to Detroit between 60 and 90 minutes. You could be in Detroit at the J.L. Hudson store from Northville. That's pretty good, you know, pretty good mass transit. We don't have that today, do we? Okay. So let's see. We talked about Sessions Hospital, which is Star Manor. That was the Northville Hospital. My oldest brother, who's 73, he was born in Sessions Hospital. Everybody was born in Sessions Hospital in town. The Norfolk Electric Shop, where it started on one side of Main Street, and then it went to the old Ware building. We talked about the gangsters came into town and broke in the old hardware store in the Ware building. And my grandfather bought that from the bank and moved it down the road because the Ware family didn't have insurance at the time, and all of his inventory was stolen all the time. The Stinson Aircraft Factory, my father talked about that. And the Northville, did I miss something? Oh, and we talked about Silver Springs, one of the original bottles. Silver Springs water was served on all the trains. It was the luxury thing to drink, and they had Silver Springs pop too, in orange and in grape. And my dad talked about going to the local store and getting Silver Springs pop. This is one of the original bottles from that. And down at this train station there, I went down there right before our last session. And my father talked about how one day they just tore it down, and there's still piles. These are some of the bricks from the original train station down there. I went down there to verify. There used to be a platform there, which he talked about getting the mail, and he was one of the kids. He did a lot of things in town, as you can see. He was one of the kids that would bring the mail big bag down there, and they missed it one time, and it blew all over the place. That platform is still there, but kind of in pieces, you know, with a cement deal down there. I wanted to verify that for him the other day. The Globe Furniture Factory actually brought in one of the desks my father has at home. It was sitting here last time. There's not too many of them left. He talked about the fire that demolished. That's where Bealtown is. Mr. Beal ran the Globe Furniture Factory, and they employed between 300 and 400 people. It was a big going operation in Northville. We talked about one of the last things, Orchard Heights, where my father lives, and others in this room today, different neighbors. The old Eaton House was the old farmhouse on Roger Street. That was Atchison lived there, and then Casterline lived there. You can see that house today. That's the way it looked at. That whole area of town between Roger Street and Clement, 7 Mile, and Main Street, all orchards. And my dad talked about going out there and hunting, and they used to tap some maple trees in the back, and he used to make his maple syrup, but it was all different trees. Apple trees, crab apple trees, cherry trees, what have you. That was the old original house. My father's in the son's house that they built. He's on Eaton Drive, so he's in the old Eaton house of Eaton Drive. So there's a few in that area. Talked about the bricks that were made right where you go into Rural Hill. They used to make bricks, and a horse would go around. My dad remembered that. And this is one of those bricks that came from that. We have some around the house. A lot of stuff around my dad's house, I'll tell you. And believe it or not, they had motorcycle climbs in Norfolk and about 2 or 3 different hills around here. And he talked about the winter would get a fancy tie from one of the local stores. They'd come from all over to watch motorcycle climbs. And one, they would go up by the Parkway, one off of Randolph, and one up Baseline, that hill that if you look from the Cider Mill and came down, you see it go straight. It's not really a road, but they used to try to have motorcycle climbs there. So now you have 4 weeks, all in 10 minutes or so, so thank you. Yes?
You're saying that the orchards had stopped at Clement. What was between Clement and Beck in those days?
What was between Clement and Beck?
Yeah.
Pretty open. I'm going to have my father answer that, but it was pretty open farm. It was all farm. We're going to talk about one farm, the Starkweather farm, which was on the other side of Beck that went from 7 to 6 miles, that whole block. So I would imagine farmland. So what the question is, what was between Clement and Beck Road as you went down 7 Mile on the other side of Orchard Heights? Was that open?
There's nothing there except farmers had their farms. There's no houses there. There's no nothing. All the way out up to Beck Road. The gravel pit was there on the off Beck Road.
Right.
And of course, the gravel pit, now it's all homes in there.
There's a couple articles, one, a lot of woods back there, and that from where OLV is back, that's where an awful lot of maple trees were. That's where they used to tap the maple trees.
Because off of Maine you go up in the hills.
Right, correct.
So-
And that's not really good farming in the hills up
Yeah.
there. But, so that was a big woods, and we talked about it earlier. My father used to hunt pheasants out there, and also they used to tap a lot of trees, but that would be in the back of where the orchards were. I believe that answers that question.
Brian?
Yes, sir.
There's one little spot there, just beyond the fish hatchery, and the Catholic sisters lived out there. There's a little pond out there. And right where the little pond was, where the Catholic sisters lived there for quite a few years. As far as I can remember, that was the only thing. There's one nice home where the Catholic sisters lived out there, and they worked at Our Lady of Victory's church in the school later on.
And then eventually, we used to kid, I went to OLV. They built the nunnery. You know, the nunnery was on the corner there of Main Street and Orchard, you know, and that's eventually they torn that down. That's where, when I was there, it was all nuns. Now it's, you know, just lay people, but the nunnery, we used to get kicked out of that. Okay, tonight is churches, telephones in town, Henry Ford and the village industries we'll touch on, schools, the Underground Railroad, the libraries and dairies. So we will try to speed it up here. So some of you didn't come to all the sessions. I was asked by a few of you if I could review a little bit, so that's the review for the night. Churches. I will have my father talk about the different churches in town. Why don't you talk about some of the churches?
Right now?
Right now, that'd be great.
All right. Brian doesn't give me much time to think about this. Well, take the Presbyterian Church. The Presbyterian Church is the oldest church in Northville. And they call it the First Presbyterian Church. And it's the oldest. One little story about the Presbyterian Church. Back after World War II, why the athletic director for Northville High School was a member of the Northville Presbyterian Church. And the minister was also interested in sports. So for 3 or 4 years in a row, I was the designated driver, and the athletic director would get tickets for the Northville, for the state of Michigan basketball tournament up at Lansing for the finals on Saturday. All 4 games were on Saturday. So I was the designated driver. So the people in the car with the Presbyterian minister, the athletic director, the Catholic priest, I think his name was Bodusky, and he was the priest of all the different Mayberry Hospital and Detroit House.
All the state facilities in this area. And somebody asked a question too, why did Detroit have all these things here? We were out in the country. This was the sticks, and this is Wayne County, so Detroit owned a lot of land out here. That's why you had the prisons and Mayberry Tuberculosis Center and the training center for young youth. Land was pretty cheap, and we were out to the end. Remember, the end of 7 Mile was at Beck Road, and that was the longest paved road at one time. You could get here, but you know they thought, boy, that's really the country. That's the sticks up there. So some people ask, why do we have all these things from Wayne County? Because we're kind of the end of Wayne County. We were the end of civilization.
So anyhow, they really worked me over being a Catholic, even though there was a priest in there in the car. So we'd go up to the basketball games, and we stayed up there for all 4 games, and then we'd come back. And this went on for about 3 or 4 years. And then the Presbyterian minister was transferred. I guess he retired. and went to Florida, and the athletic director retired from school. So I was quite associated with the Presbyterians. We had a great time there. And so in the Lutheran, talk about just the Lutheran a little bit, the Lutheran minister and one of his lay people going to his church, they got out in front of the church one day and got an arguing. And so he got so worked up, he gave her a push, and she fell over backwards. And they're going to arrest him for pushing the woman around, but they finally got that settled down. That was in the Lutheran church.
Colorful history, yes.
The Baptist church, I was a Baptist for 23 years before I became a Catholic. And so anyhow, I know a lot about the church there in the Baptist church. I'm just thinking of one happened there. They had an old organ in there, and they had a curtain around it, and they had a pump on it. So you'd pump the organ, and so we all wanted to get a chance to pump the organ. So finally, mine came the turn to pump the organ. So the minister said, now we'll have a little music. So the organ went to start up, and she said, Bruce, pump the organ. And I started pumping the organ, and the organ went, whee! She said, not so loud, not so much. So then I had to start pumping it nicely, so people could sing the song. The Methodist Church, I think we talked about the Methodist Church already. I got all the churches, the Catholic Church.
Okay, God forbid.
The Catholic Church, masses were held in my wife's father and mother's house on Dunlap. They would have mass there, and there's a few Catholics from Plymouth and a few from Northville, and they'd have mass there in the living room. Then in 1922, they built Our Lady of Victory Church, and I knew all the ministers, I knew all the priests from the very first up to the current time. I've been a member of Our Lady of Victory for a little over 70 years. But anyhow, so the church was the little church, and my wife and I got married in there in 1942. And they took down the little church and built the church that is here at the present time.
Good.
They're the same place?
Same place. So to answer your question, that was on the corner right next to the present OLV church. So just to back up, original OLV services on Dunlap and High in my mother's house, she was Catholic, of course. The men usually go to where the women would like. So my dad converted, I think closer to 80 years ago. So that was the first one. About 50 families built OLV, as you see it here, right next to, closer to the corner of Orchard and Thayer. So right out, there's like a little parking lot there, and they excavated it for something lately, and they found, some pieces of the foundation. About 100 families, which my parents were some of those, built OLV in the late 50s to what it is today, and they started that school. My brother, who is 73, he was the first class to graduate from OLV. They started with the first grade, then first and second, third. He went first through 8th grade there. So that's kind of if that answers your question. The Turnbulls kind of have some religions handled in town because my mother, big Catholic. If you're a Catholic, you're always a Catholic. Big Catholic. My father's father, who was an electrician in town, which had the Norfolk Electric Shop, he was a big Baptist. He was an elder, so that's my dad pumping the organ there. His wife, my grandmother, wasn't really happy at the Baptist church when they came here about 1900. She went over to the Methodist church. So we had 3 congregations kind of going here. So very interesting dinner table discussions at that time.
Right.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Turnbull.
You just tell her one about the Methodist church. my father was a Baptist, and we all went to Baptist church, my sister and me and my mother and my father. My father was on the board, and he was the one that hired the minister, one of the ones that hired the minister. One day my mother said, I don't like the minister. You've got to get rid of him. My father said, hey, I like the minister. He's a good man, and we're going to keep him. And she said, well, if you don't get rid of that minister, I'm going to become a Methodist. There's nothing worse than a big he said, well, honey, I guess you better become a Methodist because we're not going to get rid of the minister. So sure as shooting, she went right over and joined the Methodist church. So on a Sunday, my mother would go over to the Methodist church, my father would go to the Baptist church, and I'd go to the Catholic church, all at the same time. So we kind of helped tape up all the churches growing up. I was at a funeral not too long ago, and they opened up the book at the Methodist church, and here it said, Mrs. Jenny Turnbull gave a large donation to the Methodist church, and they told the amount that she donated.
Yep.
So anyhow,
And ironically today, I have converted back over to the Methodist church because my wife dragged me there in the mid-'70s, which is great. I've been the men's club president for 22 years, but I'm on the endowment committee too. And I had to go back in the books, and I saw that endowment from my grandmother, which was kind of neat, so true story. Let's talk about the telephones in Northville. The telephones, you want to tell the story.
Right. Before we start on that, I just want a couple of things before that. My friend, Mrs. Madigan.
Madigan.
She lives at Allen Terrace. Maybe some know her about
We were there today.
She just had a birthday.
105.
105 years old.
Today.
105.
Today.
She used to be the money counter at the Catholic Church. So Monday, this is Monday of this week, they had a party for her at Our Lady of Victory, and she's still around and she's still in good shape. And her daughter lives in Ann Arbor. Her daughter must be between 75 and 80, but she gets in a wheelchair and she gets around. So anyhow, they have a birthday party for her at Our Lady of Victory at 105 years old. 105 years old. And then from here, they went to a restaurant and had dinner at the restaurant. But me being just a child here, only 98, I got a long ways to go. One other thing I want to bring up. Remember we told the story about Joe Plunkett and having problems there with my neighbor, and he had this apple tree and the apples came down the hill. The first thing that Joe did, he went and got a saw and sawed the tree right down. And so I'm sure Mr. Eaton watched him saw the tree down. It was a miniature tree, it was about this big around, but down came the apple tree. So there was no more argument over the apples and which way the apples went. Down came the apple tree. The other thing I want to bring up, I started talking about the population of Northville and Northville Township. I got sidetracked on that. Back in 1930, Northville had 3,000 people living in it. Right now, there's about 7,000 people living in Northville, even though we took over a lot of land from Novi. We're still at 7,000. The Northville Township, back in 1930 had 600 people living in it. was all farms. People had big farms. Today, in the township, there are 24,000 people living in the township. And I would predict in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe they'll have another 25,000. So Northville Township will end up with around 50,000 people or more. And so then the township will be filled up. And so people have to start going to Salem and South Lyon. The population will have to finally go in. Okay.
Yeah, around Norfolk there's about 30,000 people. Around Plymouth there's about 90,000 people. Give or take, 5,000 people. But so yes, we do have a couple areas that could grow in the future, but we'll see how that goes. How about the telephones in Northville?
One more thing.
Okay.
The only piece of land left in Northville is Northville Downs. And that's been talked on pretty much so. People can't lose their money fast enough. So the racetrack is not as popular as it used to be. People can go to the casinos and touch the button and lose $10,000 with them touch the button. In the racetrack, they got to wait for the horses to go around. So I predict probably in the next 2 or 3 years, Northville Downs will all be into homes and different things. That's the only place that Northville has to grow. Okay, telephone.
Hang on 1 second on that. That should be a very thoughtful area, in my opinion, on how they'll develop it. There's a lot of developers like to do a Victorian village and zero lot line and some homes and some condos. I think it'll be great. It just has to be done very thoughtfully. And at the end, I'll challenge you to be kind of Northville people and looking at the history. When we get to a vote on that, let's make sure it's the right thing for Norfolk, because that's kind of the gateway to the community. That is my opinion.
Who owns the property right now?
Who owns the property right now? It's still the Racetrack Authority. It was the driving club. And they do, I guess we all know, they bought a large piece of property many years ago out on Godfredson and M14 to relocate the racetrack. But as my father said, racing is not as big a deal anymore. They go there 4 times a year, and it's fun. I mean, if I were you, go down and experience it. They have a little restaurant. You can see the races going around. It seems a little funny, but it's kind of nice to see that. But I don't think, in my opinion, they're ever going to build another racetrack out on Godfredson, and that land has become so valuable that it's probably worth doing something other than the racetrack and the parking lot. So, but again, this has to be done, in my opinion, very thoughtfully. You're all Norfolk experts now. You know all the history. Let's keep that going instead of changing the architecture, changing the area. It should be, in my opinion, a Victorian village that fits right into the downtown as a gateway to the community. Opinion.
Back to telephone.
Yes, sir. No. Yes. Go ahead.
The question. Anyhow, back when I was younger, like in high school or earlier, a lot of your people know about this, but when you wanted to make a phone call in Northville, well, wait a minute, start again. The telephone operators were upstairs, right on the corner of where the jewelry store is right now.
Main Street.
There's a side door on North Center Street. And they brought this stairway, and there's about, 6 to 8 women on high stools and sitting there. And if you want to make a phone call, our phone number in our house was 184M. At our store, it was 184J. So you pick up the telephone and you say to the operator, she'd say, number please, and you'd say, give me J on this line. So she'd go over and get a plug and plug in that you could operate this on that telephone. So everybody, that's the way people have to, their telephone. You'd have to talk to the operator on every phone call. On the night operator, there's a lady named Mrs. Watson, and she got lonesome. So I know one night, every time there was a fire in Northville, the fire whistle would blow, and then the firemen would go to the fire. So I picked up the telephone and I said, "Mrs. Watson, where is the fire?" And she'd say, "Well, let me look out the window." Well, she said, "Yeah," she said, "the fire department just went up Center Street." And so we're talking for a little while, and she said, "I guess there wasn't much of a fire because the fire department's coming back down the road." But anyhow, so that's the way the telephones were in Northville, and I guess that's the way they were all over. Not only in Northville, but when my father went to college in Boston, Massachusetts, and got his electrical degree, his first job, he went back to Canada to his father's house, and his father said, can you build a telephone line in all of your education at university in Boston? And my father said, yes. He said, if I get 9 farmers down the road the next mile, can you put up telephone for the 9 farmers? My father said, yes. Get the poles up, get the poles and put the poles up, get the equipment from Toronto, and he said, I can hook it up for you. So those farmers were all hooked up. Those 9 farmers were hooked up. 3 of them were part of the Turnbull family, besides my grandfather and grandmother. And so you take up the telephone, and there's 9 people on the line. So if people talk too long, they used to say, "Hey, get off the line, I want to use the phone." When I was in school in Northville, I'd want to call my grandmother over in Delhi, Ontario. And so I'd say to the operator, "Give me Delhi, Ontario, 3 longs and 2 shorts." They used to have the crank, you crank them. And so you want to make a phone call, you go, ring, 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 ring. So she'd say, okay. So she'd call the Delhi, and she'd get 3 longs and 2 shorts. Pretty soon my grandmother would say, "Hello." I'd say, "This is Bruce." And she'd say, "Hey, just you people get off the line. I'm talking to my grandson back in Northville, Michigan." So that's pretty much the early telephones.
That's correct. In that same philosophy, my grandfather was an electrician. They would get 9 farmers and they'd run electricity out there, and thus they would have electrified for their machinery and their house. That's what started. A lot of the knob and tube wiring came from
Just a little bit more on that.
Okay.
The little town of Delhi hooked up a little later on naturally to the national telephone, so you didn't have to, so you could make your phone calls right straight through, so then the farmers could talk back and forth.
He was ahead of his time. He put the telephones out there before Bell Telephone did. Now I just want to switch gears, talking about Henry Ford. We talked about Henry Ford a little bit and his kind of romance with Northville. He spent his honeymoon, or part of it, right here in Northville, across from where Kroger is. So he always liked this village. He liked this area. He tried to help Northville. He had a cousin here. He would deliver a car to him. If you're down at the mill race, there's a little trolley stop with a bench. He used to come to Norfolk and supposedly go on that trolley. Why? Because it's actually quicker to get around from Dearborn and around on trolleys back then. We talked about early on the the pond across from my father's house on 222 Fairbrook, down there on 7 Mile, where there's a baseball diamond now. It's just kind of all filled in with trees between Sheldon and Roger Street. Henry Ford helped build that dike, which you can see today. When you come up from Northville Downs going towards South Lyon, look for that big dirt dike. He had a railroad track that went around the top of that was used to dump all the dirt around, and he built a big dam. My father told the story about some of the workers, when they got it all done, put some dynamite in there to get the fish, because he stocked it full of fish, and that, they got fish by just a bucket full. That cracked the dam. Henry Ford fixed it again. That happened again. So he didn't fix it after the second time that the dam was broke. But Henry Ford liked Northville tremendously. He liked the rural areas. He came here, and I looked back in an old Norfolk record, and there's a picture that's Henry Ford on the left, Thomas Edison, and Firestone. They came to the Northville valve plant, the three of them, and there was a picture in the Norfolk record in the old days. So just so that gives you a concept. Henry Ford liked this area. He liked the parkway. He liked between Dearborn and here. And he started out, because he liked it so much, he started these rural different factories. Instead of the big factories in Highland Park and the Dearborn Rouge factory, this is an advertisement that was out there saying how much good he was doing in society. I just wanted to read a little bit, because I saw this. This came out, I think, right around World War II, but so this is first to demonstrate true decentralization. So he's ahead of his time. He wanted workers to work. This was a farm area. This was open area. He wanted people to have jobs. They didn't have to come to Dearborn. They didn't have to come to Highland Park. It says, let's see if I can read this. At waterproof sites in Michigan, along the Huron, Rouge, and Raisin Rivers, you see them 18 village industries established by Henry Ford. Here work nearly 5,000 men and women who know the peace and security of having one food and soil and a healthy industry. It goes on, but he's telling people this is his vision. This is what he likes. The first village industry shop was the Norfolk valve plant. It was the second one bought, but the first one that came into operation. And Kahn, who did a famous designer who did Art Deco things, he was commissioned to design a new factory down there too. Henry Ford liked this area. He wanted to give something back to the area. Every valve for every Ford was built at the Ford valve plant. 150,000 valves a day, that they said at one time. So every valve from 1919 to 1982 was built at the Norfolk valve plant. Then from 83 to 89, I was a Ford guy. I remember they used to repair gas tanks and shelving units down there. They used to re-weld them. So that factory was used. It was the first one, and it was the last one in those village industries. He wanted to give something back to the community, and there'd be 400, 500 people on a shift down there. This was a big operation. All my brothers worked there. I didn't by then, I did other jobs, but it was a big deal. Going down the parkway, so this was the first one. Envision he wanted everything by the water. What did he do? He tried to buy up all those mills that we talked about before, because he liked the water power, and he was building his house in Dearborn at the time and trying to, run that through the Rouge River. So if you come out of Norfolk down Norfolk Road, you got to Meads Mill. He built a Ford plant at Meads Mill, one of these village plants, and they built all precision gauges there, and a lot of Swedes, very technical guys, he brought in there and brought from other plants. That was there. And that plant is still there. If you look down Norfolk Road, this side of Meads Mill, it's on the side of the road. It was a distro at one time. I think it's empty today, but that was another village industry of his. Yeah, that's correct. As you keep going down Northville Road, you get to Phoenix Lake, And Phoenix Lake, there's another shop there. And that was one that I'll have you say something about. He had women that built generators and regulators, and that was pre-World War II. And they built a lot of the electrical activities for the bombers out at Willow Run there, too, all the components. Why don't you talk about, you had a relative that worked at the Plymouth Phoenix Lake, the Henry Ford shop.
I'm talking about that.
Yeah, yep.
It was for ladies only. And my aunt was 5'4", excuse me, 4'9". She was so small, they had to get a special stool for her to sit there and work. And she worked there at that time. It was women only. And it was one of the two factories. Can I add something else?
Sure, I wish you would.
In the Northville Valve factory, when they're making valves, the union had not come to Northville yet. So the foremen were real popular men, because if a foreman didn't like a person, he would say, "I don't like you, you are fired." And the poor guy, he was fired. He couldn't get out of there. So I know some of the foremen here in Northville, and at Christmas time, they got bottles of whiskey and everything else from all the employees because they wanted to keep their job. And then later on, the union came in, and so then that stopped. All the foremen being so popular. Anyhow, so then after they made all the valves. In fact, my oldest son, Bob, he worked there in the summertime, and he said, "Bob, if you have a valve caught in the machine, go over and turn the machine off before you stick your hand in there to get the valve out." So he did. The valve got stuck. We went over and turned it off. We didn't realize that the machine was running and kind of the water turning it.
The hydraulics.
So he reached in to get the valve, and in fact he took one of his fingers right off. And so when he was drafted to go to in the Army, why they said, "What's wrong with your finger?" And he said, "Well, I had a little problem at Ford Motor Car Company." He said, "Well, you can't go in the Army then, because that's your trigger finger." So he never went in, and he wanted to go into the service. The last thing that they built in the Northville factory in Northville was the gasoline tanks for the Crown Vic cars. I went down and talked to him. I said, "Can I take a tour of people through the factory?" And he said, "Sure you can." So I took about 3 tours of people through the factory. And it was the old-fashioned way. All the men were just on benches working, making the tanks for the Crown Vic. And that was the last thing they built in Northville.
Yes. Again today, if you went from Norfolk to Dearborn, you'll see most of these plants. It's amazing. They've all survived pretty much. Norfolk Valve plant, there by Meads Mill, which is Phoenix Lake, survives, and the building is there. If you continue to go into Plymouth, that plant that my dad just talked about that his aunt worked at, and again, it was funny, I read this, women couldn't be married or have any kids, and they had a strict dress policy at the time, but they were paid exactly the same as all men at the time, so that was a very productive plant for them. That factory is still there, and Wayne County has that. If you look to the right as you pass 5 Mile, where the parkway splits to the right in Norfolk down, that building is still around there. If you go to the next area, which is just up a few more miles, Wilcox Lake, and go around the back of that, that was another factory of Henry Ford that they built drill presses and other machinery in there. That building is still there, used by Wayne County. Henry Ford made a deal with Wayne County at the time. All these lakes, they had Wayne County build some hydropower, and he donated the land to them at the end, and he said he would. And to his word, that is another storage area for Wayne County. If you go past on the other side of Plymouth, you'll see this building, Napkin Mills. That was the first one he bought, and he bought that because when he was a kid, he and his father used to come out there and put their grain in there to get it ground. He always liked that place, so that was in his mind. You know, he really liked this area, just to kind of give you a psyche of Henry Ford. That one built screws. You know, about all the screws on all the cars were built there. And his philosophy was he didn't want to make things too large, too heavy, because he wanted to transport them to the bigger factories. So that built screws there. And as you go farther out by Newburgh and Hines Drive, there's a factory. There's an old cider mill he bought, and it run. Remember, there's ponds as you go down the parkway. They're not there for fun. A lot of these were built by Henry Ford in these mills before, like the mill race. That's where they used to put all the logs up in the mill pond and then bring down. He just brought it to the next level. That area did different drill bits and different things for the factories. So you can see, that gives you an idea. Henry Ford liked this area. He wanted people to have this kind of environment, the way he grew up in this industrialized era. So we can talk a long time. There's whole presentations on it, but that gives you a little bit of a concept. A lot of books here at the library about that. Streetcars, yes.
Let me just touch a little bit about
I wish you would.
When my wife and I got married, we moved to Dearborn, right across the street from where Henry Ford lived. What we call the Brady Apartments on Brady Street. And there's a real big storm that night. And my wife and I were staying on the 4th floor in the Brady Apartments. And my wife said, "I hear water running." And I said, "Honey, for crying out loud, run back to sleep." And she said, "I hear water running." I said, okay. So I got up and looked out the window. And the Brady Apartments had 2 big apartments, one side by side. The river had, had overflowed. The water was running down in between the apartments. Luckily, I parked my car up on the hill. The water was coming up about 3 or 4 feet up the steps in the apartment. And that's what she was hearing, was the water going down in between the buildings. That night, Henry Ford thought about everything. He had a dam and had a special dynamo on there to make electricity in case the power ever fell. Henry Ford got sick that night. He started to die, and he just opened the fence from where we were living. And so his wife said, "I can't turn the lights on, I don't have any power." So Mr. Ford said, "That's okay, my dynamo will catch it, we got it." And the cook took the dynamo out. So Mrs. Ford had to go over and light some candles. So Mr. Ford died by candlelight. And then he said, "Well, pick up the phone and call the doctor." They got to pick up the telephone, no telephone. And so the chauffeur had to get in his car and drive a mile away to call the doctor. So poor Henry Ford, he finally died like a poor man by candlelight and by no electricity. So
one of the largest industrialists in the world, and that is, portions of that is totally true. And remember, the Rouge River is a floodplain. It is a floodplain today. If you go down to Dearborn, if you work for Ford Motor Company, you can't go down there some days if it's raining because it's closed off. So yeah, today that home that he talks about, Fairlane Manor, is still there for tours and other things, a beautiful place. and he had hydroelectric activities right on the Rouge River. Yes, sir.
Actually, three sources. The other source of electricity, they run cables in to the house, into that area, and the flood came up and shorted out those cables. So
Right.
it's all three power.
Right, so if you know a little bit about that story, pretty unusual that he passed away without any power and, you know, under a storm with candlelight, as my father says. Yes, sir.
In the powerhouse there, in that complex, there is a painted line on the wall, how high the water was
Yep.
at night in Littlefield.
Right. It is. I would definitely encourage you, take a tour of that place. It is something special in my opinion. There used to be a restaurant there where they had the pool, and I used to take people there all the time and then walk around the house. It's a fabulous place just to see a little part of history in the past. We could go on a long time about this, but we've gone long enough tonight. So, again, Albert Kahn designed that. Famous designer at the time, Art Deco. He did Edsel Ford's original house down in Grosse Pointe. That was designed, that whole factory, to be kind of Art Deco, and you can see it today. It's still the same factory. Norfolk Library. Would you like to? Yes, sir. What would you like to say?
I just want to say the next morning, my wife and I went to get out of the apartments, and the rowboats were there with the firemen.
Yeah. Back to your point, the water was so high.
Taking people out of the apartments in rowboats.
Good. Why don't we talk about the libraries in town? The libraries.
What, the library?
The library. In Felino's old building, which is down at the mill race. Go.
I think we talked on this once before, but the first library in Northville, the building now is down at the mill race. It used to be many things. When I first moved, it was a feed store where you could buy feed for your rabbits and chickens. And later on, there was a restaurant. Many things. But they had a side door, and you could go upstairs, and that was the first library in Northville. It was for men only. They didn't figure the women needed a library. So it was $1 a year, and the men and the boys would go upstairs in the library and get a book. But no women, just men. And so that was the first one. The second library was down there at the present time, down in our, was the church. The church is, which is down at the mill race right now.
And just to give you a little history of that church, that was split off. You know, the Presbyterians are always trying to do different things. A group split off the Presbyterian Church and built this and they had a separate congregation, and that is right across the street from where the Northville City Hall is today. That would be where the mall is, or Mags, on the side of, what's that, Wing Street, where the post office is. So that sat there when I was young, and I remembered when they moved it down. So continue your story, just telling where it is.
Yeah, the second library was right there, on just a block from the post office. And before that, it was the Presbyterian Church. The Presbyterian Church in Northville, there was two factions, and they got arguing. And so one group said, hey, if you don't like our church, get out of here and go build your own church. So they did. They went up and built a church. Right up, and later on it became a library. And anyhow, so then there were two Presbyterian churches in Northville. One where it is now, and one up on what is that street up there, just with the post office?
Wing Street?
Wing Street.
Right.
Anyhow, right up on top of the hill. And that's where the library was. It was a real nice library. It had a fireplace in it. And so then later on, it was donated by Mrs. Who donated?
Well, just to continue that story,
Well, I mean, who's
Lapham? Mary Lapham.
Mary Lapham. She owned the building, and she donated to the city of Northville for a library. And they said, she said, with one distinction, she said, the Women's Club of Northville, which right now have about 125 members, they want to have a meeting in my building once a year. So every year, the 125 women go down to the mill race and have their meeting at the mill race. But she was the one that donated the library to the city of Northville.
Mary Lapham was ahead of her time. Mary Lapham grew up and there was a men's only library. So what did she do? She started a women's library there. And she was very well educated. Her father was the mayor of Norfolk at one time and a banker and this and that. She went on to become a doctor, went overseas to Europe, and they were experimenting with tuberculosis, and she was one of the ones that came up with the concept and brought it back to the States. Collapse a lung and it heals, and then collapse the other one. So she came back. She ended up in the Carolinas, but she was ahead of her time. Nothing she couldn't do at the time. Whatever the men wanted, she would do the same thing. She would ride the horse any way she wanted, side saddle or front saddle. So what I've read. So she was a pioneer, very intelligent, and one that wanted equal rights at the time, just like those ladies that worked in that village plant. Good. Two Laphams in town. It is two Laphams. That's Charlie Lapham and Jim Lapham are still around. And Charlie just won Man of the Year, and he used to have the men's store in town. A different Lapham was the mayor of Norfolk. That is Charlie Lapham. That is correct. And Jim did a lot of work on that. That is correct. Yeah. So two Laphams are an old family in town, a great family. Why don't we talk about the school and when the school burned down, the elementary school, and where did they go to school?
We're going to hear it at 10 o'clock.
No? In general.
In the early days, homes and businesses and schools burned down because the heating the place was with stoves or with furnaces. I remember in our home on 222 Fairbrook, we had a big pot-belly stove in the living room. And so then I was heating our house downstairs. And with coal, we put coal in there. And then there was a stovepipe, and the stovepipe went up and through the ceiling and into a chimney upstairs. And that chimney, that stovepipe was heating the upstairs. So that was heating our house. Everything was fine and dandy. Well, lots of times those stovepipes would get rusty and get old, and they'd fall down. They're just held together with wire. People have wire to hold stovepipes in place. So that's why a lot of the houses burnt down on the stovepipes and the coal, and then the schools and the different buildings, the furnaces would get overheated, and then they would set the school on fire. And that's what burnt the school here in Northville, right here on Katy Street.
So let me tell them, you know, this is the old village school right on Main Street today. Oh, in fact, where are we? We're right here. Right out this way. The elementary school was on, is that Linden? Is that Linden Street?
West Street.
West Street, pardon me, God forbid. West Street, and West Street used to come straight down this side. The elementary school faced the library, so we'd be looking at the elementary school, and he's going to tell you.
West Street was right off the side there.
Yep, absolutely.
Right through.
And the elementary school faced us.
So, the school was burnt. It was right on West Street. It was facing the east.
That is correct. Why don't you tell them when that burned down, what did they do? Where did the kids go to school?
Okay.
So right here in this complex is where this happened.
Northville had Northville had no schools, no grade schools. So the people on Main Street opened up their homes. And
When
they
the
put
school
a
burned
sign-
down.
They put a sign on the house. First grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade. So
The house is right on Main Street across from Old Village School. Big sign, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
the high school was built, and the high school had the 7th, the 8th, and the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. But up to that time, the Northville had no grade school. So they also went out and bought a Quonset hut and put it out on the playground. It was a big Quonset hut.
Where most of you park today, right out there.
Right out here. So they used that for one classroom, big classroom. So then the kids would go to school and they'd be, that's right in the homes. And that went on, and right away, Northville got money from the PWA.
PTA.
And they started building the school, the grade school over here,
Main Street Elementary today.
which was never used too much. The state of Michigan have a lot of silly rules and regulations. You gotta have a gymnasium, you gotta have an auditorium, you gotta have a cafeteria and all that. And that building never had those things. So they got a real nice grade school, and it's still a nice grade school, but it's not used because it doesn't. They finally got that building built with federal money. I think it was $80,000. And Mr. Ammerman was the superintendent at that time. And they paid him too much. And he tried to pay some of the money back, and they wouldn't accept it. So he turned it over to the school. But anyhow, so that's what happened. They finally got the school built. They used it for a short time. And then they started building the other schools. You want another story on the schools right now?
I don't think I have a choice. That'd be great. Yep. Another story.
Okay, this is fairly recent. There's a superintendent in Northville named Dr. Bell. And he came over from Wayne, Michigan. So he called me up one day and he said, Bruce, I got 28 new teachers I'm hiring this year, and will you do me a favor? And I said, what's that? Will you come down here at the school? And he said, we're going to have coffee and donuts, and will you get aboard the bus and take all around Northville and show these 28 teachers what Northville looks like? I said, sure, Dr. Ben, I'll do that. So I took them all around. Right now, the cross-country coach for Northville High School is still in Northville, and he was the one on the bus, took them all around Northville.
He just retired from cross country, so like how many years?
Anyhow, a little while later in the Northville record, it said, we are having a committee of 30 people, mostly all teachers and principals, and we're going to select 5 people from Northville to go over to Bosford Inn for a weekend for 3 days and 3 nights to lay out all of what's going to happen in Northville public schools for the next 10 years. So I thought, I want to get on that committee. So I called up Dr. Bill and I said, I want to go up and talk to you. So I went up and talked to him, and he said, why do you want to get on? I said, hey, I got kids in school. I want to know where my money is going to be spent. And so he said, okay, you're on the committee. So for 3 days and 3 nights, we're over at Bosford Inn. And we had a specialist come in from Wisconsin to run the meetings. So that went over good, so we laid out for the 10 meetings. So the next thing that happened, or that while we were over there, he said, oh, by the way, we're gonna build a new school, a new grade school, and it's gonna be out on Beck Road. And I listened to him, and I said, Dr. Bell, why don't you build a school on 9 Mile Road? He said, listen, Bruce. It kind of made me a little unhappy. He said, I guess you didn't hear me. We have purchased the land on Beck Road, and that's where it's going to be. I said, okay. I wasn't going to back down. So I said, if you build it on 9 Mile Road, you'd save at least $1 million or more. And I said, if the buses come down Beck Road, it's going to be so busy that it's going to have a hard time getting in and out of the school. And he said, Bruce, 9 Mile Road is a dirt road. He said, Dr. Bell, listen to me. In South Lyon, they just built a new school, and it was on a dirt road. I said, you know what happened? They paved it. So that was the end of the conversation. The next morning, Donnie Bell, she was assistant superintendent, and she said, Bruce, I got news for you. She said, Dr. Bell really worked you over, didn't he? I said, well, you know, that's okay. Well, she said, it has been proven, we checked the land out, and we could save almost $2 million on 9 Mile Road. So that's where the school is right now. It's on 9 Mile Road. And so
Between Captain Beck out there, the elementary school.
I was so
We had
happy
something to do
I
with it.
saved the school $2 million.
Yep, Gordon Creek, that is correct.
Right.
Good story, true story this time. One thing, they're all true. This building, just in passing too, this is kind of an iconic building. Bruce, my father went to school there. A lot of people in Northville, even the old, I went there as a sixth grader, but the building itself is pretty iconic. As you know, and you're reading in the Norfolk Rec and other things, they would like to move the Board of Education in there, and that school they talked about, that elementary school next door, that could be raised in the future, and there'll be some Victorian homes next to that, and the school district would get a few $1 million for that. But I personally believe this is a much better iconic school to preserve than the other one. So I think we're going to see and read and talk about that in the future. I'm fully supportive, and I think we both are of that. But you're going to see that. Starkweather Farm. We talked about different families. We talked about the Starkweathers. The farm was out 7 Mile on the other side of Beck Road. Stonewater is there today. If you see the water coming down in the wall. I mentioned that because tonight we're talking just a little bit about the Underground Railroad. This was a major station, the 19th or the 16th. I've been told different things by different people who know, older people that understood and what have you. I'm friends with Mr. Thompson, who the Thompsons bought that land from the Starkweathers. And a couple stories about that. So again, today, that's where that farm was. The farm, remember farm, somebody asked, you know, what was out in these different areas where their homes. Their farm ran from 7 Mile to 6 Mile, you know, just this side of Beck, you know, to Ridge area. Big farm. The Thompsons came to town and bought it from them because they knew gravel was a big deal in this town. He did all the geological surveys, and remember, in the Ice Age, it stopped here ever so slightly, and it deposited all that gravel. He bought that and had one of the largest gravel pits out there, but he was telling me the story too when they bought it. Two things. One, Mr. Starkweather, this is about the 3rd generation by then, big tinsmith. And his sister, Mr. Thompson's sister, would go over there. They were very old, a lot going on in their lives, but you know, a little older, a little bit more mature in life. And they'd shown Mr. Thompson this small little tea kettle and teapot that he made, this tinsmith. I mean, it was actually precise. They ended up down in the Carolinas, one of their relatives built a whole hotel around it and put that on display. Why I say that, Big Tinsmith, you probably all saw a movie called The Wizard of Oz. Mr. Starkweather supposedly built that suit for the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz because he was known as quite the tinsmith out there. In the back, so that faced on 7 Mile area, right where that Stonewater is. If you go into Stonewater and go down that road and it ends at this gazebo, that's where the barn was, I was told. This is before my time. In the old days, that's where a lot of the people stayed, the passengers on the Underground Railroad as they came through that area. That was one area in town, and it's been documented many times. Again, the Underground Railroad had different lines to it. It's a metaphor of the railroad, but they were traveling. The conductors are ones that would travel with them from stop to stop. It would come through Indiana in this area and come through Ohio, but in Northville was kind of a hotbed to help on the Underground Railroad. There's 3 different areas in Northville. Where are they trying to get to? To Canada. Detroit River and the St. Clair River to go over to Canada. What I've read, over 100,000 people were on the Underground Railroad. That is an awful lot. Up to about 1960, they believe there's that many people. So a lot going on in this area. The Ambler Hotel, which we talked about earlier, which is on Center Street and Main Street, that's where those apartments are, or the condos today, on the southwest corner. Underneath of that, when I was a kid, that was a big gully down there, and the bowling alley was behind that. It's a big impression. They had a lot of storage in the area. Supposedly, in the Underground Railroad days, people would stay there at night. Remember, they would travel during the night, and during the day, they would stay at these different places. One last place, the Katy Inn. It's down at the mill race. We've talked about a lot of different places. That was a tavern and an inn and a lodge right over here on Katy Street and a stagecoach stop. It was mentioned that they would keep some of the passengers on the Underground Railroad during the day as they traveled. So Norfolk has a rich history of assisting. Of course, you have the Methodists in town, the Presbyterians, and others in the Catholic. Everybody was trying to do the right thing back then, so there were 3 different areas, so I understand reading a lot of different things. With that, let's talk about the Grennan Farm Crest.
It's, I need to probably do the last one.
Yep, Farm Crest.
And it was scripted to them.
No, we're going to do the chicken one. Do Grennan's.
Okay. Mr. Grennan had a big farm on 6 Mile Road, and he was Mr. Northville in Mr. Northville Township. He was the man of the whole area. He had about at least 100 acres on the north side of 6 Mile Road, and it was right. His house was right situated where the old Northville Township Police Department was. Anyhow, and then he had another 100 acres on the south side of 6 Mile Road. His job, he had a business called the Grennan Cakes and Pies, and he had a big factory in the city of Detroit, and he had his ovens and his cooking, and he had all the grocery stores in this part of the area of Detroit, and with the Grennan Cakes, and he made all the Grennan Cakes, and he had a beautiful farm, he had a beautiful home, and he had a big cow barn, and he had a big horse barn, and
all the way out to Haggerty, all the way out where Ward's Presbyterian, from the middle of where the township hall is, all the way out there.
And so he had on his farm, he was growing all the ingredients for making all his pies and cakes and all his different pastries. And he had a real good business going. And so he also had a whole a bunch of cattle in the pure Jersey. A Jersey cow is a smaller cow, and it's kind of it's almost black. And the bulls are real mean little devils, and so you got to be real careful of them. So he had a whole barn full of Jersey cows that would use for his milk to make his pastries. And so he had that for his milk, and then he had his farm for growing all the ingredients of his bread and cakes. A man came by and said, "Mr. Brennan, I would like to buy you out. I'd like to buy your name, Mr. Brennan, and I want to buy all your ovens and everything in, and I want all your grocery stores that selling them." And he said, I'll give you some money for it. Mr. Brennan said, "How much will you pay me?" And I can't remember what it was, but somebody said it was $1 million. Well, $1 million back in the late 20s and the early 30s, and that was a tremendous amount of money. So Mr. Brennan said, "Hey, it's a deal." So the fellow paid him the money. The only trouble was he didn't put any stipulation that you go back into business again.
No non-compete clauses. They didn't do that.
So anyhow, as soon as he got everything else sorted around, he went back into business called Farmcrest. And pretty soon, after a few years, Farmcrest was bigger than Brennan was. So he had two things. He had the money, and he had a business going again. Mr. Brennan was a big Presbyterian here in Northville. So he said, "Well, I guess I better do something for Northville." So what he did, he built the building at the Presbyterian Church where the dining room is, and also the place where the Rotary Club meets. That whole building was built by Mr. Brennan. He just gave it to the Presbyterians in Northville. Well, his wife said, "Hey, honey, I'm a Catholic. We got to do something for the Catholics too. You just can't give it everything to the Presbyterians." So he said, "Okay." So she was one of the biggest donors for the new Our Lady of Victory School, or Our Lady of Victory Church. She donated the money to Our Lady of Victory. He donated his money to the Presbyterians. So later on, we started selling milk. And this is one of the bottles that the Farmcrest dairy. It says Farmcrest right on it. And we used to go out there and get milk. And I don't remember ever paying anybody, but what they did, they had like a shed out there, and like a refrigerator shed. Oh, one other thing. On Sundays, he had a bunch of polo ponies. You know, you ride the horse and then you hit the ball with a polo stick. And so a lot of people from Northville, including my father and me and my sister and my mother, we would drive out on 6 Mile Road, and they'd have a polo game. They'd have a team come in from Torrey Point with their polo ponies. And it was just to the east of his home. And so we'd watch the polo, we'd stand there by the fence and watch the polo games. And so that was really something. Mr. Brennan was one of the riders, and his daughter is also one of the riders, playing polo in the polo team. So his daughter said, "Daddy, I want to get married, and I'd like to have a home." So he went and said, okay, I'll build you a home. So he went out and bought some land on 6 Mile Road, just before you get to Beck Road. And it's just a dirt road, down the hill, down by the creek. He built this home there. And so that's where his daughter Evelyn and her husband lived. And there's somebody here, and you live close to the house.
The home is still there today. It's a big log cabin that he built for his daughter. Yeah, the subdivision goes all around that house, I believe, today. Beg your pardon? No, so you know what he's talking about. Yeah, so there's truth in all these stories.
All these beautiful $600,000 and $1 million homes. Here this log cabin is. That was owned by Mr. Grennan. He built that to give it to his daughter for a wedding gift.
Now you know the rest of the story of that log cabin by your house there.
We were told it was a hunting lodge.
Well, he built it, but then he modified it for his daughter. So that was, remember, all open land, but I think he made it a little bit nicer for his daughter. So that's come up. Was it a hunting lodge? Was it the house? His daughter didn't move in there. I think he modified it for.
We had an electrical store, and they had some electrical problems. I was sent out there by my father with another electrician, and we did some work there in that building back in the 30s. So.
Last story of the night. We appreciate your patience, but there's a lot out there, of course. There's one story we talked about the high school, and I was just looking this week with Wendy some of the old Norfolk records, and this is from 1937, and it says, well, folks, the class party of 1937 is almost at hand. It's going to be quite a boaty affair. Boating was their theme, I guess. And the class president of 1937, Bruce Turnbull, is the acting master of ceremonies that night and captain of the ship, and then it goes on. With that, we're going to talk about that night of the senior prom and what happened that day for the senior prom. Mr. Turnbull.
This is something a little different. Back in the 30s, 1937, we graduated out of Northville High School. We didn't have enough money to go to a fancy hotel for our senior prom. So they would close this gymnasium down for a whole week. And we'd go in there for a whole week and we'd decorate the gymnasium. We would take paper and trim it all the way across the gym, so the whole ceiling was covered with paper, strings of paper, different colors, and we had it all decorated up. So for our senior prom, we even had one of the fellows, his name was Scott Cole. He went and built a rock garden inside the gymnasium with a fountain in it. And I said, Scott, how are you going to have the fountain run? He said, I got 2 hoses in the place where the janitors are. And he said, one is coming in and one's going out. So the night of the senior prom, we had a fountain going with all beautiful flowers and rock garden and so forth. Well, anyhow, getting ahead of the story a little bit. I was the president of the class, and I made up I went downtown Northville, and there's a fellow named Orlo Owen, and he had a men's store, and he had a tuxedo hanging in the window, and it says $29.95, and that was everything, the pants, the shirt, the cufflinks, the whole deal, $29.95. And I said, hey, I got to get that tuxedo to wear to the senior prom. Nobody ever wore a tuxedo. They just wore a dark suit. So that night I went home and I said, and I heard my mother say to my dad, if Bruce don't take care of those chickens, I'm going to have you get rid of them. Oh, that was a great idea. So the next morning I went down to Mr. Hill Northville meat market. I said, Mr. Hill, are you buying chickens? And he said, yeah. He said, how many you got? I said, I got 24 chickens and a rooster. And he said, everybody had chickens those days. And anyhow, I said, how much? So he told me how much of why they were a pound. And I said, okay, it's a deal. So I went home, chased all the chickens in the chicken coop, got some bags, and caught the chickens, stuck them in the bags, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 6 or something in each bag. I had a whole 24 chickens, put them in my dad. I had the car, my mother's car. So I took them out to the meat market, gave him the chickens. He gave me some money. I went right down and put a deposit on the tuxedo. Of course, my father didn't know anything about this. The next morning, I heard my father say, Jenny, that's my mother, call Cracky Lake. Cracky Lake was the chief, was the policeman. And he said, why? He said, somebody stole my chickens. And she said, well, why don't you talk to Bruce? He might know something about it. Well, I knew my father was in no position or condition, and I wasn't either to talk to him. So in our house, we had an upstairs porch and went down onto the garage. So I went out I got dressed to go to school and went out on the porch and on the roof. I went right down and jumped off the roof and ran to school. I didn't want to talk to my father. So anyhow, my mother came to my aid, and so he grounded me for the whole summer. That's beside the point. The thing is, I got the tuxedo, and I put it on, and I went to the senior prom with a tuxedo, the only boy there with a tuxedo at the Northville school over there. And actually, I was kind of embarrassed because nobody else had a tuxedo on, and I was the only one that had a tuxedo on. And I think that's the only time that tuxedo had ever been worn. But anyhow, so I finally made it to the senior prom. And anyhow, it was a great success. But like I said, it was 12 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night. In the gymnasium, they had a racetrack up around the top. And for 25 cents per person, the parents could sit all around the track and look down and watch the girls and boys dance. And so my father and my mother were there. And of course, my father saw the tuxedo down there. Anyhow, so that was a wonderful deal. But we made a little money too to go to Washington under 25 cents. But like I said, I was grounded for the whole summer. No car, but I had some friends that have a date and have a car. But that's more or less the end of the tuxedos, the end of the chicken.
That's the chicken story. We've heard it many times around our house, especially around Thanksgiving. But, I'd like to thank all of you for the last 5 weeks and the culmination of a lot of stories, some history. What we would ask for you, be Norfolk enthusiasts, be involved. Look at some, we talked about buildings they might tear down and other things. We all live here, and for the benefit, let's try to keep it the Victorian village that it's been 100 years ago. We're going to have, hopefully, a huge bicentennial celebration in 2027. Maybe we'll do this again then when Norfolk is 200 years old as a community. It's 150 years old as a town or as a village right now, but to me, the biggest thing is 200 years as a community in 2027. also, there's so much, if you didn't get, we just touched on different things. There's so many resources here and at the mill race for you to get involved with and look at different history. Wendy in the back, who's in charge, will guide you. You know, we've talked through this past 5 weeks, Hoffman's, the first 100 years in Norfolk. We kind of brought you up to the next 100 years, too. Hoffman was a good friend of my father's, and he said my father should write the second 100 years, and he basically did verbally for you tonight. Also, there's books. My father used to do walking tours. Just, you know, it's a quick little book. You can walk down the different streets with this book. Take a look at that. All these different ones are available in the library. And the latest one, you know, mostly all pictures. Now you know the history. You've been there. That's the building that my father was born in Northville, on the cover, and it talks about that. So I would ask, get involved, you know. Keep Northville the way it is. It's great. It's a community because we have that touch point downtown. It's the same town it was 100 years ago. Walk through that alley where Norfolk has some pictures. You'll see the pictures of a lot of things he talked about in his father's shop and my other grandfather's barber shop, right in there. So again, we thank you very much. Hopefully this has been entertaining. Hopefully you've learned a little bit. I thank my father very much.